Welcome to Perimenopause Hell. This video deals with the basic topic of what is perimenopause. So first of all, let's talk about menopause. Most people know what menopause is. Everybody knows that your periods stop, and everyone seems to know about the hot flashes. The average age for periods to completely stop is 51 in both the UK and the United States. But there is this assumption, and don't forget, this assumption is made by doctors as well, that women only have symptoms in the year of menopause when their periods stop. Now, this isn't true. Women also get symptoms in perimenopause, and this can last up to 10 years. And in our patient-led support group, we see up to 90 symptoms. That's a lot of symptoms for a lot of time. Basically, once you're over 40, you're in the perimenopausal zone. So we're going to let you know what you're going to face. But first of all, we have to discuss what your body has actually done for the last 30 or so years, and it will have done this every 28 days or so. So let's look at what our ovaries do. Now, if we start over here with these what are called primary follicles in the egg nest, basically your ovary makes estrogen, and under the influence of estrogen, those follicles grow into mature eggs. And around day 14, your body has selected which one of these eggs is suitable and best to release. And so you see here where it says release of ovum, actually the egg comes out of the ovary and leaves an injury there. It's a blister where the egg has popped out. I love to do that popping noise. And that's around day 14 or so. Now, because the ovary actually has an injury there where the egg popped out, a little blister, the body has to heal that. And that blister is called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum makes progesterone, and it makes that up until about day 26. And after that, it's healed and it stops making progesterone. And within 48 hours, you start to have your period. So by the time you're 40 or so, your ovaries have been doing this for over 30 years. And the poor things are absolutely knackered. So this is the end of your reproductive years. Your ovaries then stop releasing eggs. You'll find in perimenopause that they don't just shut down releasing eggs like that. It gets more sporadic. You may ovulate some of the time and not all of the time. Your ovaries eventually stop making estrogen and they stop making progesterone. But they do continue to make some testosterone, and the amount varies between women. So basically, your body has to get used to the fact that you're not going to have as much estrogen as before. And it's the estrogen that really causes the problems. So for most of your adult life, you've had lots of lovely estrogen, and there's estrogen receptors all around your body, in every organ, in your skin, in your scalp. It makes your hair lovely and long and lush. It makes your skin radiant. It makes you attractive to the opposite sex. So, Mother Nature's no fool. She wants to get you pregnant. So as estrogen starts to decline, during perimenopause, your body starts to reduce the amount of estrogen it makes. So it doesn't, for most women, happen overnight. It takes some time, and this is what happens during perimenopause. The levels of hormones fluctuate, and they can go up and down and be a bit of a roller coaster. So estrogen tends to fall, and even when you were younger, this happened as part of your cycle. It dropped off around periods and ovulation. And so when you're older, your background level of estrogen is lower anyway, and this causes some unpleasant symptoms that you will notice around periods and ovulation. But basically, your body is getting a chance to slowly adapt to the lower levels, and this is actually much better than if you went into menopause suddenly. Some women do, of course, go into menopause suddenly if they have a full hysterectomy where their ovaries are removed, and believe me, usually it's brutal. So, actually, perimenopause is the easier way out. It won't seem like it to women who are having a really rough ride, but that's the truth. So, what happens in perimenopause? It's like those warning lights on your dashboard suddenly come on, and you start noticing symptoms. And as you get closer to menopause, those symptoms will get more noticeable and become more of the time. So, it won't just be around periods and ovulation anymore. It will start to dominate and you'll start skipping periods. So, what are those low estrogen symptoms then? So, the one that most women notice is hot flashes. 80% of women get those. And the night sweats are really a kind of the nighttime version of hot flashes. So, those come along too. Insomnia is another very common one. And in fact, it can be the case that no sleeping pills will work. Nothing works for some women until their estrogen is raised somehow. Palpitations are another extremely common one and can be very frightening. Women think they're having heart problems and so on, but most of the time, really, it's just low estrogen. And vaginal atrophy affects 50% of women. A lot of women don't want to hear this news, and who can blame them, that everything down below starts to shrivel and shrink under the influence of declining levels of estrogen. But this is why I wanted to run the group. I particularly am on a quest to make sure that women know about vaginal atrophy because it's about the quality of the rest of your life. So, how do we control symptoms? Well, there are some very well known ways. Replacing the lost hormones. We can do that using combined birth control. We can do that using hormone replacement therapy, although both of these have a risk of increasing the risk of breast cancer. And there are something called phytoestrogen supplements, which are the natural alternative, but those are much weaker than the artificial hormones. So, medicines which can treat several symptoms at once can also be very helpful. There are antidepressants, and a lot of women say, oh dear, I'm not depressed. Why is the doctor giving me antidepressants? We do have separate videos on all of these topics, by the way, but antidepressants do actually work on things like hot flashes and so on. So they're actually a very useful option. And of course, they don't have the cancer risk of the hormones. Things like gabapentin can also work, and there are many, many other medicines. For example, if your palpitations were very bad, you could take beta blockers. Those really help, and they also help with anxiety too. So, many of the symptoms actually are anxiety and depression based. We didn't mention those before, but they're a bit of a separate and side issue. We have separate videos on many of these topics, so this is really an introduction. So, we've talked about estrogen at great length. What I also want to talk about briefly is progesterone, because a lot is said these days about progesterone, because since the WHI study that revealed the link between HRT and breast cancer, progesterone has become the good guy and estrogen is the bad guy, even though really estrogen is the one that produces the symptoms. So, if we look at what happens in our cycle, as we mentioned earlier, your body only actually makes progesterone for 12 days in a 28-day cycle. So, it's not even there all of the time. Your body doesn't actually need progesterone in the same way that it needs estrogen. But it does have a very important use. You need progesterone to maintain the condition of the uterine lining. So if we look at this picture of a normal womb, the uterine lining is a normal thickness. Now, if you have too much estrogen or not enough progesterone, you develop something called endometrial hyperplasia, where the lining of the uterus becomes too thick, and that's actually a risk for uterine cancer. So progesterone is very helpful in dealing with this. So if we look at what happens on a monthly basis with your uterine lining, what estrogen does in terms of your uterus is it actually builds the uterine lining, a bit like bricks in a brick wall. But the progesterone is like the mortar, and that goes between those bricks and helps to make the uterine lining stable and strong. So this is what happens all throughout the month. The endometrium proliferates, it grows, and that wall starts to thicken. But once you ovulate on day 14, the corpus luteum starts making the progesterone, and that wall becomes nice and thick and strong and stable. And then day 12, the progesterone stops being made. 48 hours later, you have your period, and everything is all nicely timed. Now, what happens in perimenopause to many women is that, well, if your periods are still regular, you definitely have enough progesterone, but the quality of it seems to be a bit different, and you may experience some spotting. This means that you start bleeding at various times, and it's only a little bit of blood, so it might be something that you notice after sex, before periods, and at the end of periods. You just go on bleeding a little bit for quite a long time, or it may happen after you exercise. This is because the stability of the uterine lining is not as good as it was before, because you don't have quite the same situation with your progesterone. It's a good idea to get a smear test just to check there's nothing unpleasant going on, but it is quite normal and common. So you see I've coloured the progesterone a bit lighter to show that it's not as strong. And you may notice that every so often you just bleed a little bit. What happens later on is that you don't ovulate quite so often. And of course, when you're not ovulating, there's no egg popping out, there's no blister that makes the progesterone. So no ovulating equals no progesterone. And what goes on in this instance is that uterine lining becomes a bit fat and thick. You start skipping periods, and you can get some chaotic bleeding and some flooding. So what happens when you don't ovulate? There's nothing to time when your period should happen either. So the endometrium just keeps on growing and growing and growing and growing and growing, and it's not stable. It gets too thick, and then eventually what happens is, because it's so unstable, it just starts to bleed anyway. And that can be all sorts of different kinds of bleeding. It can stop and start, it can be clotty, it can be gushing, it can be just an annoying, not very heavy type of bleeding that just carries on for ages and ages and ages. So the main reason that we need progesterone is not really to deal with the symptoms of perimenopause as such. You don't need it in the same way that you need estrogen, the estrogen that you had every day when you were younger. The progesterone, you only had those 12 days in a cycle to mature your endometrium. So the main use of progesterone in perimenopause is to control abnormal bleeding and overgrowth of the endometrium. And also, if you have that spotting that you find annoying, well, the progesterone will control that as well. It can control when you have your periods too. So it's usually part of an HRT regimen, but only because it prevents cancer of the uterus, because that thickening of the endometrium is actually a risk for cancer of the uterus. So it's a good idea to take progesterone for that purpose. Okay, that's the end of this presentation. I hope you found it useful. If you did, then please give us a thumbs up, like and subscribe. The link to the group is in the description box below. We now have Twitter and MeWe as well as Facebook. So, and that's the end. Thank you for listening.